The great empires had been fighting with light for so long that the assumption had become invisible, the way the most fundamental assumptions always become invisible. Laser cannons, particle beams, concentrated stellar energy directed across the vacuum with precision that had taken millennia to develop. These were the instruments of galactic warfare, and they were elegant in the way that things become elegant when enough generations of intelligent minds have spent enough time refining them. Battles unfolded across light seconds. The strategy built around the delay between the moment of firing and the moment of impact. Every admiral's calculations accounting for the speed of the thing they were trying to hit, and the speed of the thing they were trying to hit it with. Light moved as fast as anything could move, and so light was the ceiling, and every species in the galaxy had made peace with the ceiling. Human ships appeared at the edge of galactic civilization, and produced no revision to this understanding. They were slow, their hulls were unremarkable, and their weapons were projectile-based in a way that suggested a species that had not yet arrived at the sophisticated conclusions everyone else had reached long ago. The empires cataloged them and filed them under civilizations that would either develop or not, and moved on. Dr. Eris Thorne was working in a research station in an unremarkable system when he arrived at the thought that changed everything. Light was fast, but light required something to be. The void between particles simply was without traveling, without limit, without the constraint that movement imposed on everything else in the universe. You could not outrun the absence of something. Darkness had no speed limit. He sat with the implication for 3 days before he wrote anything down. The asteroid field was chosen for its distance from anything populated, which Thorne had insisted on and the Admiralty had agreed to without fully understanding his reasoning. His reasoning was that he did not yet know what they were dealing with, and he wanted room to be wrong safely. The event horizon held position at what felt like a reasonable distance, and the technicians deployed the projector with the careful movements of people who have been told something is important, but have not yet been told why. The projector did not look like a weapon. It looked like a sensor array with modifications that didn't quite make sense if you assumed it was a sensor array. It did not fire. It did not emit. It opened. That was the word Thorne used in his notes, and it was the accurate word. A sphere of absolute nothingness appeared in the space 2 meters across, and everything inside the sphere's boundary encountered the condition that matter encounters when the quantum fluctuations that normally underlie its existence are simply absent. The 10-ton asteroid that occupied those 2 meters ceased to occupy them. Not violently, not explosively, with a completeness that was more unsettling than violence because it left nothing to respond to. The sphere lasted a fraction of a second. The asteroid did not return. A technician whispered that they had become gods. Thorne shook his head and said they had become something worse, the absence of gods, which was a different thing entirely and considerably more dangerous. The Admiralty representatives in the observation deck were not listening to the philosophical distinction. They were already drafting production orders. The Kthur had been expanding their lightship fleet for 400 years, and they had the confidence that comes from 400 years of nobody successfully challenging the result. 200 vessels represented a fraction of their total capability, which was itself the reason they sent only 200. The engagement was expected to be brief, and the remainder of the fleet had other assignments. The human force of 3 cruisers registering on the Kthur Admiral's display did not prompt a revision to this assessment. It prompted amusement, which he shared with his bridge crew, who received it well. The light beams that crossed the void toward the human cruisers were precisely aimed and would have connected with any target that behaved the way targets were supposed to behave. The human cruisers did not raise shields. They did not maneuver. They activated their projectors, and the void spheres that opened around each vessel swallowed the incoming beams in the same way the sphere in the asteroid field had swallowed the rock, completely and without remainder. The Kthur sensors showed the beams traveling, and then showed nothing, which was a reading they had no existing category for. The human response came inward rather than outward. The void spheres appeared inside Kthur hulls, at the locations where engines and reactors and crew stations had been a moment before. Shields were designed to stop things arriving from outside. These arrived from nowhere. 200 ships became 200 empty structures in less than 30 seconds. The Admiral's final transmission was one word. The human commander's answer was the only accurate description of the asymmetry. They had fought with light, and humanity fought with what light could not illuminate. The news traveled at the speed that significant news travels, which is faster than light when enough people are motivated to relay it. Every empire with a diplomatic presence anywhere near Cthulhu space had a full account of the engagement within days, and the accounts agreed on every detail because the Cthulhu sensor records had survived intact inside the hollow shells of their fleet, and humanity had made no effort to recover them. The records were meant to be found. The records were the message. The arms race that followed had a specific and repeatable structure. Each empire acquired a void projector through whatever means were available. Each empire's engineers reverse-engineered the components with the thoroughness that self-preservation motivates. Each empire's operators attempted to interface with the neurological control system and discovered the same thing. The system required a quality of attention that their minds could not produce. Void projection needed an operator who could genuinely visualize absolute nothingness, hold the visualization with precision, and direct it. This was not a technical skill that could be trained. It was a perceptual capacity that either existed or did not. Thorne appeared before the Galactic Security Council and declined to provide the theoretical framework they were requesting. He told them there was no framework to provide. He told them what the capacity actually was, which was the ability to see nothing because you had spent enough of your existence living inside nothing, inside the particular darkness of a species that had spent millennia doing the worst things possible to itself and had emerged from all of it still present. You could not learn that from documentation. You could only acquire it by living through what produced it, and he would not wish what produced it on anyone in the room. The Cold War had the specific quality of a standoff between parties who understand the asymmetry completely and are trying to find a response to it that does not require acknowledging the asymmetry out loud. Every empire with a diplomatic apparatus had a working group on void weapons within a month of the Cthulhu engagement records becoming public. Every working group reached the same conclusion within a year. The conclusion was classified at the highest levels each respective government possessed, because the conclusion was that there was no conclusion, no path from current capabilities to void projection that did not require something the available engineers and physicists did not have. The Lightkeepers convened on a world that belonged to no major power, which was the closest thing to neutral ground the galaxy could offer, and Thessa presented her theory to the assembled scientists with the careful delivery of someone who has spent weeks preparing to say something that will be difficult to hear. The void weapon did not generate nothingness, she told them. It revealed it. The quantum potential that existed between particles was not empty. It was full of the possibility of existence, held in a particular state by the ordered way that structured minds perceived reality. Human minds did not perceive reality with the same order. Their cognition was chaotic in ways that the other species present had spent their entire histories trying to eliminate from their own thinking, because chaos felt like a problem to be solved. In humans it was not a problem. It was a perceptual tool that allowed them to collapse quantum potential into genuine absence. The council sat with this for a long time. Their final resolution was a single recommendation: ask the humans to stop, and hope the asking was received well. The soldiers came back different. Not injured in any way the medical systems could locate or treat, but different in the specific way that people are different when something has been removed that was previously present and cannot be identified precisely because its absence is its only evidence. They ate less. They slept in irregular patterns. They sat in quiet rooms and looked at nothing with an attention that suggested the nothing was the point rather than the absence of something better to look at. The psychologists named it void sickness because naming things was the first step toward treating them, and they worked on treatment with the urgency of people who understood that the weapon which required human consciousness to operate was also the weapon that was consuming human consciousness to operate. Thorne presented his findings to the Human Council with the controlled anger of someone who had been correct about a risk and had been ignored and was now watching the risk become a reality. He told them the weapon was not destroying enemy ships. It was destroying the people who aimed it. He told them humanity was becoming hollow, which was a different kind of threat than the ones the void cannons were being deployed to counter. The chairwoman listened to everything he said and then told him that an armed galaxy would not wait for humanity to recover its ethics, and that the choice between void sickness and extinction was not a difficult calculation. The automated systems were built and deployed and failed uniformly, because the void required a mind that could genuinely perceive nothingness, and no machine could genuinely perceive anything. Humanity operated the weapons, and the weapons operated on humanity, and there was no exit from the arrangement. Kale had been a void gunner for 11 months when the sickness arrived, which was longer than average and shorter than he had hoped. He recognized it from the descriptions. the cold that had no temperature, the sense of his own edges becoming uncertain, the way colors seemed to be losing their claim on existence. He had watched 3 gunners from his unit transferred to medical care in the preceding weeks, and he did not want to follow them. He sat in his quarters and tried to understand what was happening to him, which was not the approach the medical protocols suggested, and turned out to be more useful than the medical protocols. The void was absence. He was filling with it because he was spending his working hours projecting it, and he was not putting anything back. The solution arrived in his mind with the simplicity of things that are obvious once stated. He started painting. He started writing in a journal every evening, not about the war, about specific things he loved, described in enough detail that reading the entry back would return the feeling. He kept a recording of his sister's laugh on a device he carried at all times. He called his parents when the communications delay allowed it, and told them things he had previously assumed could wait. The sickness receded. He taught others. The 80% reduction in void sickness rates across the fleet produced a paper from Thorn that was read by every void gunner as required training. The other species received translated copies and understood the principle completely and could not apply it, because the dance between nothingness and love was a human choreography, and learning the steps required having been shaped by the music that had produced it. The decade of Cold War produced a human void fleet that was also, by any external measure, the galaxy's most culturally active military force. The sketchbooks were regulation issue by the 3rd year. The journals were encouraged from the first deployment briefing. Music libraries were maintained on every vessel with the same priority as weapons diagnostics. A void gunner who could project nothingness into an enemy reactor core would return to quarters and spend an hour with a book of poetry or a recording of rain, and this was not considered unusual behavior but standard practice, because the commanders who had implemented Kale's methods understood that the practice was the operational requirement rather than the recreation. Thessa arrived on Earth with her research credentials and her genuine scientific curiosity, and spent 4 months interviewing people across every category she could access. She sat with void gunners in their off hours and watched them make things, paintings, small sculptures, letters to people at home. She attended the poetry reading because someone had told her it was a good example of something, and it was. She watched soldiers who had recently erased enemy vessels sit in a room together and weep at verses about the transition between seasons, and she recorded her observations with the precision she brought to everything, and the addition of something that precision alone could not produce, which was being moved. Her conclusion went into a classified file and stayed there, because the thing it said was too useful to the wrong people. Humans were chaos organized by hope. They had spent their entire history falling and had developed, in the falling, the capacity to fly in the dark. Their vulnerability was not separate from their weapon. It was the mechanism. Veska had survived the Kthur engagement by circumstance rather than design. She had been on a diplomatic vessel at the system's edge when the void spheres appeared inside the warships, and the diplomatic vessel had been left intact because humanity was making a demonstration rather than conducting an extermination, and demonstrations require witnesses. She had watched 200 ships become 200 empty structures in less than 30 seconds, and she had been watching humanity ever since, with the specific attention of someone who understands they are observing something that will determine what the future looks like. She stood before the Human Council with the stillness of someone who has prepared for a conversation for a long time and has decided that composure is the only thing she can control in it. Her voice trembled anyway, which she did not try to correct. She said they could not defeat humanity and could not replicate what humanity had built, and she was not there to pretend otherwise. She was there to say something that no military emissary in her empire's history had ever been sent to say, which was please. She told them what she had watched across 2 decades of observation. The soldiers who painted before missions and after them. The ones who wrote in journals and kept recordings of voices they loved. She said she had seen the gap between those 2 activities widening, the creating self and the destroying self separating from each other in ways that the creating self did not always survive. The destroying half was growing. Thorn, standing at the back of the chamber with the posture of someone who had been waiting a long time to be in a room where his conclusions were being heard, said nothing. He did not need to. Someone else was finally saying it. The vote was not unanimous, which was expected, and it was not close, which was less expected and reflected how thoroughly Veska's testimony had landed in chambers where Thorn's identical arguments had been deflected for years. The restriction was specific, Void projection was authorized for defensive scenarios only, each offensive use requiring committee review that would take long enough to make offensive use functionally impossible. The void was not being put away. It was being placed in a case that required deliberate effort to open. Kale received the appointment to lead the ethics board with the particular quiet of someone who has been given a job that matters and understands that taking it seriously is the only appropriate response. He did not redesign the oversight process or introduce new metrics. He visited every void gunner in the fleet personally, and he looked at the sketchbooks and listened to what they said about the poetry and asked about the gardens they were maintaining or the people at home they were writing to. He removed from void duty anyone who could not show him something they loved, and he did this without ceremony and without explanation beyond the one he had already given in the training documents. The void takes hold where there is nothing else. Fill the space and the void cannot enter it. The creed came from something he said to a group of new gunners that someone thought to record, and that spread through the fleet in the way that things spread when they are exactly what people needed to hear. We project nothing. We protect everything. It went onto the walls of every void vessel within a month, carved there by the crews themselves. The trust did not arrive quickly, which was appropriate given how quickly the fear had arrived. Empires that had been maintaining void research programs in parallel with their diplomatic communications continued the programs after the restriction announcement, because announcements are not verifiable and the programs were insurance. The programs continued failing, and the failure continued being the most reliable evidence that the restriction was real. If humanity had shared the technology, the failures would have stopped. Thessa's follow-up report circulated through the same channels as her classified original, this time without the classification, because the council that had classified it had decided the argument it made was more useful as a public document than as a secret one. She wrote that humanity had done something the galaxy's entire recorded history contained no precedent for, which was choosing to limit a decisive military advantage voluntarily, without external pressure sufficient to compel it, because they had assessed the advantage as a cost they could not afford to keep paying. She called this the highest form of wisdom available to a species capable of it. Kale read the report and felt the specific discomfort of being described accurately in terms that made the thing sound better than it felt from the inside. A reporter found him in his office and asked him to respond to Thessa's characterization. He said they were not role models. He said they were people who had been consuming something that was destroying them and had decided to stop, and stopping a destructive thing was not wisdom but survival, and he preferred to call it what it was. He said they prayed every day that the choice would never need to be revisited. Then he went back to work. The 20 years accumulated in the way that peaceful decades accumulate, in the background, noticed mostly in retrospect when comparing the current moment to something earlier that now seemed distant. The void gunners who had served in the Cthur engagement retired or transferred. The soldiers who had learned Kale's methods from Kale directly trained the generation that followed them, and that generation trained the next. And by the time Senna was old enough to visit the museum, the chain of transmission had been going long enough that it had the quality of tradition rather than policy. The museum occupied the original research facility, which had been preserved with the specific care that is given to places where something important and irreversible occurred. The projector was in the central display case, lit from below in a way that made it look both ordinary and significant. Senna stood before it for a long time reading the placard, which described the asteroid test with the precision of scientific documentation, and then added the detail about Thorn that the archivist had decided belonged in the same sentence as the achievement, that he had spent the remainder of his life trying to undo what the achievement had made possible. Other visitors moved through the space around her with the comfortable inattention of people in a museum on a pleasant day. They did not linger at the projector. Senna moved to a bench in the corner where it was quiet and opened her sketchbook. She chose a rose because roses were specific and specificity was the point, and she drew it with the slowness of someone who is not in a hurry, because the thing being drawn is the entire purpose of the time being spent. The museum staff dimmed the lights twice before she noticed it was time to leave. Senna had not intended to share the drawing. She had done it privately, in the corner of the museum, and had photographed it afterward the way she photographed most things she made, as a record for herself rather than a publication. The caption came from the same unguarded place as the drawing. She posted it and went home and thought no more about it until her notification feed became something that required active management rather than occasional attention. 1 billion shares in a week was a number that required a frame of reference to mean anything. The frame that settled for her was the Void Gunners, because they were the ones who had found the image and passed it through their networks first, before anyone else, recognizing in it something that matched what Kale had been teaching them for 20 years. They printed it on paper and kept it in the same pockets as the journals and the recordings of loved voices. It traveled from them outward to everyone else. The journalist who interviewed her was looking for a statement about symbolism and received instead an explanation that was more honest and more useful. Senna said the rose had thorns, which meant it could hurt you, and was beautiful anyway, which meant the hurting and the beauty were not in opposition, but were part of the same thing. She said humans were both of those qualities simultaneously. The void was the space between them, neither thorns nor petals. What determined the outcome was not the void's existence, but which part of the rose received the attention and the care and the water. The interview spread faster than the drawing. The museum's curatorial committee debated the placement for 2 weeks before arriving at the decision that turned out to be obvious in retrospect. The rose drawing hung on the wall directly across from the projector's display case, at eye level, the same size as the placard describing the projector's function. Visitors entering the room encountered both simultaneously, and the encounter produced a specific quality of attention that the museum staff began to notice as a reliable pattern. People stopped talking when they crossed the threshold, and did not resume until they had looked at both for long enough that looking became understanding. Mira had been painting flowers for 50 years by the time she was asked to speak at the anniversary ceremony, and she had been declining similar invitations for most of that time because she did not consider herself a representative of anything except her own experience. She accepted this one because the 50th anniversary felt like something that deserved a witness who had been present at the beginning. She told the assembly she had been wrong in the early years, along with everyone else who had thought the void made them powerful. What it had made them was empty, which was the opposite of powerful in the ways that mattered. The work of the subsequent decades had been filling the emptiness back up, not with weapons or strategy or the management of a galactic advantage, but with art and love and the stubborn refusal to stop being the kind of being that made things rather than erased them. They had won the real battle not through strength, but through persistence, she said, and through keeping one true thing in their minds even when the void was loudest. That the universe was full, had always been full, and that seeing the fullness again, after learning to see the void, was the most important thing any void gunner had ever done. The void research programs that other species had been running in parallel with their diplomacy did not stop when the Cold War ended, because scientific curiosity is not subject to political resolution. What changed was the direction. The weaponization programs had all reached the same wall and stopped there, and the researchers who had been facing that wall for years redirected with the practical energy of people who have been pointed at the wrong problem and have finally been given permission to find a different one. The medical applications emerged from Veth research within a decade, which surprised no one who had been following Thessa's theoretical work. Void bubbles at surgical scales could resolve interior structure without the physical intrusion that conventional imaging required, which made them immediately valuable for any condition involving tissue that was difficult to access. The Cthulhu engineers adapted the radiation shielding application from principles that the void restriction had inadvertently made public through the process of explaining what the restriction covered and what it did not. Humanity shared the theoretical framework without reservation once the restriction clarified that the framework was not the weapon. The distinction proved productive. Saren's paper arrived in the field the way papers arrive, when they name something that everyone has been observing without having the right frame for it. The void was not a window into emptiness. It was a surface that reflected the nature of the mind perceiving it. Human minds projected chaos and created flowers from the chaos. Ordered minds produced equations that described what the chaos was doing. The void showed each species something true about itself. It had been a mirror the entire time. The grave was maintained by the research institute that had absorbed Thorne's original lab, which considered his work foundational in the specific way that work is considered foundational when understanding it requires first understanding the moral questions it raised. His name appeared in the first week of every introductory void theory course, attached to the quote about becoming the absence of gods, which students argued about for the remainder of each semester. The young researcher arrived on a Tuesday morning with a rose she had grown from a cutting taken from a plant that traced its lineage, through a documented chain of cuttings and regrowth, back to a garden that Senna had planted after the museum visit with the proceeds from the rose drawing. She placed it against the headstone and said what she had come to say, which was brief because the important content was in the doing rather than the describing. She walked to the hospital on the other side of the city with the projector in her pocket, a device no larger than a coin, calibrated for the resolution required to image neural tissue without touching it. The child had been waiting for 3 days for the scan that conventional equipment could not perform safely. The void projector could find the darkness inside the child's brain and make it visible to the physicians who needed to see it. This was what void did when the person using it understood what it was for, not erasure but revelation. The darkness made legible so that light could be applied to exactly the right place. Thorne had wanted that. The canvas of nothingness had been there the entire time. Humanity had finally learned to paint on it carefully. The transition happened gradually, and then completely, the way fundamental changes happen when they are not being resisted. The void moved from the category of weapon to the category of phenomenon, then from phenomenon to infrastructure, then from infrastructure to the unremarkable background of daily life that children grew up inside without knowing they were growing up inside something that had once been considered a source of existential threat. Engineers used void principles in construction, creating building materials with structural properties that conventional matter could not achieve. Physicians used void imaging across a range of applications that expanded each decade as the theoretical understanding deepened. The void cannons on the decommissioned warships were disassembled by teams who understood both what the components had done and what the components could become, and the transition from one to the other was documented carefully because the documentation was the lesson. Cale's funeral was attended by beings who had known him in different contexts and mourned him accordingly, some as a soldier, some as a teacher, most as the person who had taught void gunners to fill themselves with enough living to carry the void without being consumed by it. His grave received the rose bush because it was the right thing, and everyone involved understood it was the right thing without needing to discuss it. A child asked her grandmother the question that children ask when they have encountered a concept in school and want to know what it actually means. The grandmother took the question seriously, the way the question deserved. She said the void was where new stars were born, in the cold dark between existing things, and where new ideas took shape before they were ready to exist, and where love found the room to expand that it could not find in space that was already occupied. The child stored this in the place where true things are stored, and went to sleep. The light purists had chosen their name to signal what they were for rather than what they were against, which was a tactical decision that did not survive contact with their actual methods. The bombing of the Void medical facility was documented in full by the facility's own monitoring systems, which continued recording after the attack and produced footage that the galaxy's news networks circulated with the completeness that comes from footage that speaks for itself. The purist sphere was real, and their logic was not, and the combination produced actions that the population they were trying to persuade found impossible to support. The Human Council session convened within 48 hours. The arguments for void strikes against purist infrastructure were made by people who understood why the argument was wrong, and were making it anyway, because the attack on the medical facility had been the kind of thing that produces pressure to respond in kind regardless of whether responding in kind was wise. The arguments were heard and rejected. Lyra had not planned to speak. She was there because the council's deliberations were public and she was in the city, and she had opinions that she had formed across a career of using void projectors to locate tumors in people who would otherwise not have known the tumors were there until the tumors were beyond treatment. She said the purists were not seeing the void when they looked at it. They were seeing their own emptiness reflected back, and the response to seeing your own emptiness is sometimes to attack the mirror. Attacking the mirror back with void weapons would confirm everything the purists believed about what the void was. The council had to outlast them instead, with patience and education, and the unglamorous sustained effort of showing people things that were true until the true things accumulated enough weight to shift the balance. And with roses, she said, because the rose was the argument that had always worked when the other arguments had not. The healers traveled without announcement, which was Lyra's preference and the strategy's requirement, because announced arrival creates the conditions for organized reception, and the goal was not reception but encounter. They set up in community spaces on Cthulhu worlds, public buildings, open courtyards, places where people already gathered for reasons unrelated to void technology, and they offered the scans to anyone who wanted one, and they explained what the scans could find and what finding it early meant for the person being scanned. The mother whose child's brain tumor was detected at a stage that allowed complete treatment did not become a void advocate in any organized sense. She simply told people what had happened when the topic arose, which it did because the change in her child's prospects was visible and people asked about it. The father with the spinal injury told his own version. The grandfather with the restored eyesight had a larger social network than the others and told his version more often. The purist's support eroded the way support erodes when the gap between the argument being made and the observable reality becomes too wide to maintain simultaneously. Lyra worked in the clinic on the Cthulhu home world for 4 months without discussing the purists once. She discussed the patients in front of her, their conditions, what the void projector was showing her, what the physicians she was working with could do with the information. The statue was the Cthulhu government's idea, and she did not object to it, because the plaque said what needed to be said, and the image said what the plaque could not. The projector in one hand, the rose in the other. Nothingness can heal, if we fill it with love. The garden outside the museum had been planted by visitors over decades, each one bringing a cutting or a seed from plants that traced their lineage back through the chain of cuttings to Senna's original, which had been propagated from a plant she grew after the museum visit with money from the Rose Drawings licensing, which she had not expected and had used for the purpose that felt most appropriate. The garden was not officially maintained by the museum. It maintained itself, the way things maintain themselves when enough people care about them without being organized about it. Lyra stood between the projector and the drawing for the last time with the specific attention of someone who is doing something for the last time and knows it and wants to be present for it rather than anticipating its ending. The guide who approached her had the particular combination of recognition and uncertainty that young people have when they are not sure whether recognition is appropriate. Lyra confirmed it and answered the question. She said the void was not a thing you possessed or a technology you operated. It was a relationship between a mind and the fundamental absence that underlies existence, and the quality of the relationship determined what the void did in response to the mind encountering it. Fear produced weapons. Curiosity produced understanding. Love produced healing. Humans had arrived at love through the long and costly route of everything else first, and that was why they were still here. She bent to the garden on the way out and took a single rose with the unhurried manner of someone who has somewhere to be and is not in a rush to get there. The projector in her bag was already calibrated for the child's scan. The rose was the reminder of why the calibration mattered. The girl sat on the clinic table with the particular stillness of children who have decided that stillness is the correct response to a situation they do not fully understand, but do not want to make worse. Her mother's hand was warm around hers. Lyra activated the projector with the practiced ease of someone who has performed the same action thousands of times and has not stopped finding it significant, because significance does not require novelty to persist. The void bubble expanded inside the girl's skull, painless, invisible, smaller than a marble and precise as intention. It found what it was looking for and showed Lyra what she needed to see, and what she saw was small and benign and early, which was the best possible outcome, and the one she had learned never to assume until she saw it. She told the girl and her mother clearly, and watched relief cross two faces at different speeds. The girl asked to hold the projector, and Lyra placed it in her small hands. She turned it over with the attention children give to objects that have just done something important. She said it did not feel like nothing, which was correct and which Lyra confirmed. She said it was a window and told her to look through it, and the girl held it to her eye and saw the room, the desk with its flowers, her mother's wet cheeks, Lyra's face watching her with the expression of someone who does this for the reminder as much as for the outcome. The girl understood something without having the words for it yet. She handed the projector back and said thank you. Lyra said no, and meant the direction of it exactly as she said it. Senna grew into her work the way people grow into work that was waiting for them, steadily, without drama, with the accumulating confidence of someone who is doing the thing they were shaped for. The sketchbook was a deliberate inheritance from both the soldiers who had learned Kale's methods and the artist whose name she carried, and she filled books at a rate that required her to carry spares. She gave the drawings to patients at the end of appointments, specific drawings made during the appointment, because she had learned that a drawing made while someone was present in the room held something different from a drawing made in general. The patients kept them. She knew this because she occasionally encountered the drawings in homes when she made follow-up visits, placed in the specific locations where things that matter are placed. She visited the museum on a Tuesday, which was when she happened to be in the city, and stood between the projector and the original rose with the quality of attention that the room reliably produced in people who arrived at it having thought about what it contained. She took out her sketchbook because the room required a response, and drawing was her response to things that required one. She drew the projector not as the weapon it had been or the tool it had become, but as something in between those categories. A hand extended across a space that was empty but not vacant, the kind of space where contact happens when both sides are willing. The void between the hands glowed in the drawing with the specific quality of things that are full of potential rather than empty of content. She called it what it was. The museum accepted it the same week and placed it where it belonged, next to the original. Two drawings across a century, saying the same thing in the same language, which was the language of nothing, which was the language of everything. The Rose Garden Wing was the curator's name, and it was the right name, and the curator knew it was the right name from the moment she said it aloud in the planning meeting, and the room responded without debate. The displays were organized around stories rather than chronology, because chronology told you when things happened and stories told you what the things meant, and the wing was built for meaning rather than sequence. Letters from families. Sketches by patients who had been asked to draw something during recovery and had drawn what was in front of them, the nurses, the window, the flowers that someone had left. X-rays made possible by void imaging, showing what would otherwise have been invisible, annotated with handwritten physician notes describing what the visibility had allowed. The statue was commissioned by the museum's board and designed by a sculptor who had read everything written about Thorne and had decided that the essential image was the one that appeared in almost no official portrait, but in many personal accounts. Him standing in the courtyard of the original research facility after the asteroid test, holding a flower from the pot on his office windowsill, looking at it as though it was the most complicated thing he had ever seen. The sculptor gave him that expression and that flower and the projector in the other hand, and captured in the combination what the placard then said in words. He had feared what he created and hoped for what it could become, and his hope, having been given enough time and enough people willing to carry it forward, had not been misplaced. School groups filled the wing on weekdays with the productive noise of children encountering history that has not yet become abstract, because the people who had lived it were still just barely within living memory, and living memory has a texture that documents alone cannot replicate. They learned what power cost and what power could become when the cost was paid honestly and the lesson was kept. The story continues in the way that all true stories continue, not by ending, but by becoming the ground that the next part of the story grows from. The void is in the clinic and the classroom and the construction site and the research lab and the garden where the roses have been growing for longer than most institutions have existed. It is in the hands of healers from species that once could not imagine touching it, and in the minds of children who have never known a version of the galaxy in which it was only a weapon. The dance continues. Each species found its own rhythm for it, which was what Lyra had hoped for, and what Kale had predicted, and what Thorne had feared would never happen in time. The Veth approach it with the precise curiosity of minds that want to understand what they are touching before they touch it fully. The Kthur approach it with the careful deliberateness of people who remember what it cost to learn it was not what they had feared. Humans approach it the way they have always approached the things that matter most to them, which is imperfectly and with love, and the imperfection and the love together produce something that the precision and the deliberateness alone could not. A child in the rose garden draws a star because the rose has already been drawn, and the star is what she sees when she looks at the space between the roses. She calls it the light we found in nothing, because that is what it is. Her mother looks over her shoulder, and the child explains that the void is not empty, which is something the child knows the way children know things that were never secrets, simply and without having to work for it. Somewhere in the between, the void receives this and responds in the only way it has ever responded to minds that approach it without fear, which is with the particular quality of space that has been waiting to become something and has finally been given the attention it needed. The dance continues. The roses bloom. The stars wait in the dark to be found.